Hello, hello, and welcome back. I'm Satorri, and we're playing Kerbal Space Program on Career Mode. This is Wraith Space Industries. Now, if you saw the last episode, we focused on exploring some basic rocket design concepts, but now it's time to put them to work. Let's start by checking our contracts. After all, we need to keep the care bucks rolling in so we can keep building rockets for science. Now, as our obvious low-hanging fruit, we do have the next World Firsts Record-Keeping Society contract. Since we made it to orbit, they now want us to fly by the moon. A flyby, mind you, only requires us to enter the moon's sphere of influence. That's to say the point where we're temporarily and significantly being affected by its gravity. That'll definitely be our next agenda, and our rocket testing has definitely given us a clue what that might take. Ooh, and it looks like we also have a very simple contract from Floyd here. Recover or transmit science from space around Kerbin. It's easy peasy. Alright, so let's review what we have in our active contract queue. Alright, well, we still have our Juno splashdown test. That's going to be a pretty easy one to test, I think. But let's focus on our moon flyby first. So we have our swivel hull. That's the one we've really struggled to really nail. From what we've seen so far, hitting it or missing it, we're not going quite fast enough before hitting the altitude. And we haven't missed it by much, but it hasn't quite matched our optimal ascent. So we probably just need a slightly more aggressive takeoff. We also still have our Mark 16 parachute test, but we've established that this one wants us going very slow, pretty high up. So it's definitely not a thing we're getting in a normal course of business, but it's probably something that we can accomplish with any of our little test jumps. And finally, we have our heat shield test, where again we've just barely missed out because we haven't been going quite slow enough. I wonder if we can do this one with a controlled suborbital hop. And probably a fair number of reverts to just get the speeds and the altitudes just right. Let's also check in over at R&D. Now, we didn't actually launch anything after our cheesy science last episode. That was just simulations, see. So we don't have enough science to buy any new tech, but it'll be good to know what we're looking for. And we know we want to get into space exploration for the pressure gauge and our next bite-sized morsels of science on each mission. Now, these propulsion systems, you can't really tell, but they're actually tiny. These are really for making unmanned probes that are tiny and light. Now, we're definitely going to want to get into electronics. It's got the first radiator, it's got a new battery, solar panels. We like renewable energy sources. Lights, and the probe core. So the probe core will be another key part to making satellites when the time comes. And then miniaturization, as you might have guessed it, yep, more small parts. Now, let's see, flight control has our control surfaces for aerodynamic steering, and advanced flight control has the bits for RCS rocket controls, which will become more important the heavier our rocket gets, when we're trying to twist them around in space. But it also has the lander can, which is really handy for picking up Kerbals. Now, what we're really looking forward to is command modules because of this sexy beast. So the Mark 1-2 command pod can actually pack in 3 Kerbals, and it comes in a larger size form, so it'll match those big fuel tanks we picked up. It'll be a huge boost in terms of having extra seats for rescues or for bringing additional specialty crew beyond our pilot. Like, we can bring a scientist who can reset our goo and materials, so we only have to carry one to do the same experiment in multiple conditions. As you might imagine, that's a really huge asset to any significantly advanced space program. Definitely not forget our heavy rocketry. This is where we have a Poodle and the Skipper, which will be crucial to our next heftier rockets. The Skipper is the Swivel's big brother, while the Poodle is basically the Terrier's cousin in the next size up. We also have a bigger solid fuel booster, but as we have fuel lines now and our new shiny knowledge about asparagus, we'll rely on these a lot less. Enough of all that, let's start working on our design to fly past the moon. Wait, I am realizing that we are missing a very important tool, and it doesn't directly affect our design, but it does affect how much inefficiency we need to plan for. So when we update the tracking station, because we already updated our mission control, we'll get the ability to do maneuver nodes. And in general, our trajectories on the map while we're in mission will be a lot more detailed. Because we don't have that yet, because we can't afford it yet, we'll have to allow for extra fuel to do less optimal maneuvers, as I try to blow them from memory. In our experiments last episode, we figured out a rough idea of how much it takes to get a rocket up to and past the orbit of Kerbin. And we actually chanced upon a slapdash design that actually got us a good stretch out towards the moon. And from looking at the map, the moon's orbit is actually ranging between about 11 and 14,000 kilometers altitude above Kerbin. So we know we can push our rocket up there, but now that we're trying to do something specific, we're going to budget our extra fuel so we can make adjustments as we eyeball it. Now, we'll start with the standards, our command pod, our science junior. Two of those as I think about it, and we'll try to pass two big zones on our flyby. There's the space high above and the space near the moon. I don't remember the exact cutoff between the two, but we'll figure out that altitude as we go. For science! And we won't forget our engineer's chip, so we can keep our engineer redux details in flight. A few temperature sensors. With these, let's actually do 4, so we can get the 2 that I mentioned before, plus 1 for our landing biome, and 1 more for just in case. We'll also tack on our goo, and let's stick with 3 for efficiency's sake. These are a bit more expensive than the temperature probes, and we'll do it in 3-part symmetry. That way we can keep it nice and balanced. And okay, this is a good core. Now let's not forget. We're going to want to protect our butt. We're going to want to protect our butt for when it gets hot, because our butt is prone to getting hot. That's just how we roll. And we'll get our stack decoupler on there now, because this top portion is going to be the part that we actually land back on Kerbin. We'll add our drogue chutes for safety and our Mark 16 primary chute, mostly for the cap. I mean, alone it would not be enough to land this big chunk that we're bringing back, but it also gives us the nice conical top, and why not? And for our main chutes, let's actually do 3-way symmetry, and we'll kind of match that so that it looks visually nice, complementing the goo positions. Now we do have these clunky batteries, but at this point, I don't think we'll need them. Now we're gonna design this backwards, stage-wise. So the next part we'll tack on is the portion doing the pushing in space. We'll get our tall fuel pod and our carrier for the more efficient vacuum thrust. And you can see that gets us our first helping of delta V, which is quite sizable. But also note that our thrust to weight ratio is rather low. That's actually okay, because we're not trying to overcome gravity at this point. We're just trying to push ourselves around in space. And we actually expect it to be lower with the Terrier, because the Terrier gets its efficiency by shoving less hard. So it just means we do longer burn times when we're in space. And you know what? We're actually going to be doing a lot of maneuvering out in space, so let's tack on another little bit just to make sure we have our bases covered. Let's see. Okay, we'll do the half stack, and there, see, that just got us another 600 delta V, just for safety's sake. All right, and next let's grab another stacked coupler, and we'll make some space so that we can add more stuff below this, because now we're going to add our main engine for liftoff. So we'll just slip a half-size fuel pod in here. I'll explain why the smaller size in a moment. And we'll tack on our swivel. So our swivel will be our main way that we steer on our ascent from Kerbin. And now we'll tack on some radial decouplers. Let's do these on the side that matches the axis that we're going to turn over. Alright, so, and got to get them just right. Must look pretty, or it's not right. We'll get a full-size fuel pod. Make sure it's lined up right. It's very important. Very important to rocket design. Now, we're going to use our Reliant engines on these side pods. The main reason we're using the Reliants here is that we don't need more steering. It'd actually be a little too much. And also, in exchange for not having the gimbal, they actually have a heavier thrust, and they actually gain a little bit of efficiency in atmosphere. Now, when you're reading these cards, here's a quick idea of what you're looking at. So the thrust over here, and that's how hard the engine pushes. And again, it has two values, one in atmosphere and one in vacuum. Next to the ISP, this is a value giving you the idea of the relative efficiency of the engine with a range from atmo to vacuum. And down here is the fuel consumption rates, which gives you an idea of how fast your engine will chew through the fuel at full throttle. Now you can see how the swivel shifts thrust and efficiency from the Reliant, how those values shift, and that's why we're going to use them in slightly different ways. Now let's fix our side pods a bit. We still don't have our launch stabilizers, so we're going to want to slide them down so we have a nice stable base. And our decoupler, so you can see there's that little filler in there that's actually just blow-away panels. We can't actually mount on that, so we'll adjust that a little later. But before we go further, let's fix our staging so that the engineer tells us the right stuff. We'll fire all our boosters from the start. We'll decouple the sides before we decouple the central column. And we will activate our Terrier when we disconnect our swivel. And let's tweak these. We definitely don't want to fire the parachutes before we decouple that, because we're going to be doing our whole re-entry with a decoupler. And then let's sort out our drogues. And you know what? Let's separate out our Mark 16 just in case we have the opportunity to complete that contract. Now you might notice here that our engineer is only giving us one stage of rockets before the switch to the Terrier. And that's actually because we haven't linked the fuel lines yet. So what that means is the central pod, which has half the fuel of the side pods, is going to burn out before our sidearms. And those sidearms are set to decouple first. So the engineer thinks that we're just going to lug that empty central pod along, when in fact, we made that pod smaller because we're going to link them. So this means that pod will actually still be full. So let's link those down. And we'll gotta get that right. There we go. Now, you see, now it's actually showing us 3 stages, that our thrust to weight ratio is actually a bit low on that middle stage. But we'll aim to finish our Kerbin orbit creation with this, so we shouldn't be relying too much on this to overcome gravity. So being below 1 isn't a big deal, or being close to 1. So let's try to bump our delta V up a bit. We need about 3,400 in total to get into a stable low Kerbin orbit, bearing in mind that part of that will be done out of atmo, so the numbers shift between the in-atmosphere and out-of-atmosphere delta V. We probably will use our Terrier for some of that, so we don't need to go too crazy on the earlier stages. Now, in fact, you know what, let's duplicate our side pods and really make the most of that asparagus concept. So we'll start by fueling up our swivel just a little bit. This also lets us be a little tidier on attaching those side pods, so we have a nice stable base. And let's see, we'll ditch those fuel lines and replace them once we've got our other bits attached. Now we duplicate the side pods, get them nice and square, and fix our levels so they're balanced. Don't want this wobbling like a table with a short leg. That would not be pretty. And now with our fuel lines, we're going to want to connect them from, let's follow the same direction we were going. We want to connect them from the ones we will disconnect first to our side pods that we will disconnect next, and from there to the core. There we go. And so we've already got a nice bump in our total delta V. Oh, and you know what I'm forgetting? We need to fix our staging again. So mind your staging, people. All 4 side pods are firing first. That's what we want, but we need to swivel with them. And we need to separate out our radial decouplers, because these will detach first. And there we go. So, and then the side ones. All right, we'll just bulk up our second stage a bit, just make sure that's getting us into orbit when we need the lift. And we'll mind our aerodynamics. Aside from efficiency, it just looks nicer. And let's see, for a finishing touch, yeah, here we go. Let's use some lift surfaces to give our rocket a little bit more stability on the ascent. That way, with this kind of long, slender rocket, it's a little less prone to flipping. And there we go. Let's see if this design has the oomph we need. So we'll name it the Tourist, Mark 1, because we know there will be more. Let's not forget, we'll put Valentina in our pilot seat because she is our #1 pioneer, first in everything. Oh, you know what though? Our rocket's only costing under 30,000 Kerbucks. That means I think we have enough money that we can afford to upgrade our astronaut complex. So what that'll do is that'll actually let us do EVAs and EVA reports, which will be another helping of science. We'll follow the takeoff trajectory that you should be very familiar with now. And by the magic of editing, you can watch at a super accelerated speed so we can get to the next bit of interesting. Now, getting your orbit nicely will be made immensely easier with the ability to use maneuver nodes. So you place these nodes on your flight path and adjust the burn until it predicts a new orbit or the path that you want. And then, when you get to that point in your path, you only have to point your rocket in the right direction and burn for the duration that the node tells you to. Both of these are helped by the interface, and if you, depending on how well you execute, you'll end up in roughly the new course that you wanted, depending on how well you execute the directions. But right now, we don't have that, so we're really just guessing, which is only slightly terrifying in space. And seeing as I am actually made of rust, okay, our first intentional circular orbit is not the prettiest. I make no excuses. So remember how we burn at apoapsis to achieve our circular orbit? Well, in order to execute this well, especially using the Terrier, we have to start our burn before reaching the apoapsis. And we'll burn for a fairly long time, around a minute or so in this case. Because we're burning for so long, the ideal is that we wouldn't actually burn in the same direction the whole way through. Before we start the burn, we want to adjust our nose a bit down, and a bit after the apoapsis, we want our nose a bit up. That way, we'll maintain our near-side altitude while expanding our far-side altitude, thus making a nice circle. But if your burn takes too long and/or you don't get your angle tuned, what happens is what you see here on this attempt. Your butt actually dips into the atmosphere, which lowers your near side below the 70 kilometers, and you end up pushing your far side higher than is ideal to just keep from not getting pulled back into the planet. Because you're made of rust, of course, we're going to accept these awkwardnesses gracefully, and because we're human and because we do science. And to do science is to fail repeatedly while writing it down, until eventually you can succeed and do it well because you understand the situation better. Now, the next stage is to achieve an intercept with the moon. To do this, we're going to burn at a point on our orbit to expand the far side of our orbit until it comes close to, reaches, or crosses the moon's orbit. Somewhere around there, the moon's gravity will grab us for just long enough that we can then do whatever we need to do when we're out there. Now, that said, we can't just aim for the moon where we see it, because the moon is also moving, also orbiting around Kerbin, just as we are. So if we were to, if we're going to make a smart intercept, what we need to do is actually aim ahead of it at just the right angle so that we get to the same point at the same time. For this, of course, because we don't have the tools to tell us if we're aiming right, I'm just going to go purely from memory, and hopefully everything turns out fine. Now, mind you, part of the reason we wanted a nice circular orbit was to make it irrelevant where in our orbit we do this burn. Because remember, the apoapsis and the periapsis are actually the most efficient places to burn, and anywhere on the side is less efficient for expanding it. But in this case, we actually planned for inefficiency, so we should be covered. Go us. So here we've aimed our intercept, we've rolled our dice, and we'll see how rusty my eyeballs just really are. So with a little bit of an in-game time warping. So remember, as in our orbit, we are going fastest at our periapsis and we slow as we reach our apoapsis, and this becomes really pronounced when our apoapsis is so much larger than our periapsis. And look at that. We nailed it. We nailed the intercept. Oh yes. Go us. Victory dance. So now we'll have our flyby, and you saw that we'll just skip through the influence of the moon. When we do that, the moon can either take some of our momentum, or we can take some of its. This all depends on how we pass, and it's actually what's called a gravity assist. And so when we steal some of the moon's momentum, we actually come out going even faster, and that's what's called a slingshot maneuver. It's actually a really useful, albeit challenging thing to use, because basically we can, just by passing the moon, we can get a big increase in velocity without using any fuel. And actually, as it works in terms of physics, because momentum is a product of mass and velocity, our tiny, tiny rocket gets a big bump in velocity, but the massive, massive moon loses almost a negligible amount of velocity. Still, it's kind of funny to think that if we did this over and over again, eventually we could deorbit the moon. Here you can see we're collecting all of our science because we're in a new region. This is the high above the moon region. And, you know, we must collect all of that delicious, delicious science. So now we're coming into a pretty high moon altitude here, and we want to pass through the near space to get that science. I don't remember the exact altitude where that region changes, but I do remember that I like to target an orbit below 20 kilometers, usually closer to 15, to establish an orbit before landing. So let's aim for 20, because I know that'll be safe in near space. And because we haven't closed an orbit, and we don't really want to, because if we close that orbit, we'll have to spend a lot more delta V to break that orbit. So instead, we're not going to do the optimal periapsis burn where we usually would. So instead, I want to introduce you to the other two axes that go with the prograde and retrograde. So prograde and retrograde, remember, refer to pointing along our trajectory or opposite to it, respectively. The next axis we'll refer to are the pink triangles on the nav ball. Those are normal and anti-normal. Here the language gets a little tricky if you're not up to speed on your 3D geometry language. But if we had a nice flat equatorial orbit, meaning our path is a circle that matches the belt line of a planet, the normal direction would be pointing in the same direction as the North Pole. So you could describe this as being perpendicular to our orbit, to our orbital plane, but in 3 dimensions, the proper term is actually orthogonal. Anti-normal, of course, is the opposite direction, and this is relative to the pole of the body whose influence we're in, so it'll get a little wonky when we start approaching polar orbits. You can think of these as the other extreme to equatorial orbits, where we'll actually pass over each of the poles on our orbit. These will be really useful for specific purposes that we'll discuss later. So the third axis, and the one that we're interested in right now, is the radial and anti-radial. So I figure these should make a little more intuitive sense. Basically, the radial direction is pointing towards the center of the sphere of influence. The anti-radial is pointing out from the center of the sphere of influence. So when we have maneuver nodes, I'll actually be able to illustrate these much more clearly. But for now, the radial direction on our nav ball, they're the blue circles. So because we don't have our maneuver nodes yet, we're just going to do this by eyeball. So we'll orient our rocket with those balls, the blue circles, as our guide, and that lets us know that we're pointed in the right direction as we're approaching the moon. And burning that way lets us bring our periapsis down. So you can see as we burn very gently, because we don't want to overdo this, we're just going to bring that periapsis down below 20 kilometers, just to make sure that we can get that near science. Of course, bear in mind, because we are burning it all, we are changing our influence, our effect from the moon's gravity, which means when we escape the moon, because we're not going to close this into a circle, we're going to have a completely new relationship to Kerbin. And we're just going to have to deal with that when it comes. Alright, now we'll time warp our way in. We'll figure out the line that separates the high above from the near the moon. We'll collect our near moon science, and time warp back out to see what our situation is relative to Kerbin. Oh my, yes. Okay, so our little maneuver actually resulted in a pretty huge bump. So for our modest little radial burn, we now have exit velocity from Kerbin. So we'll need to rein that in, and to do that, we'll burn retrograde to get our periapsis down to Kerbin. Now also, as it happens, our lack of batteries has given us a little problem, so we're now running short on electrical charge from all of the orientation changes we've been making using our reaction wheels. Those reaction wheels consume electricity. So really looking forward to those solar panels now. All right, so accordingly, we're going to need to return using an air brake maneuver. Whenever we're doing these kind of returns to Kerbin, we'll have two ideal options. Either we air brake using the atmosphere to slow us down, or the safer but a little more fuel-intensive process. We would actually get our periapsis down to a low Kerbin orbit, and then when we get to the periapsis, we would burn retrograde to make a nice low orbit all the way around. And then it would just be like as if we would just be deorbiting as if we had just gotten up into orbit in the first place. In this case, because we don't want to worry about running out of charge, because if we run out of charge, we can't reorient our craft anymore. And if we can't reorient our craft, then we're not going to be able to deorbit ourselves. So we're just going to try and shoot straight for the atmosphere, and hopefully we don't run out of charge while we're re-entering. And given our altitude, we can expect a certain velocity when we're entering the atmosphere based on our mass. So we're going to guesstimate a periapsis around 25 kilometers, which is a little on the low side, but it definitely we will not skip off the atmosphere. And hopefully it's not too steep. And when we arrive, we'll just orient ourselves butt first into our trajectory and let the atmosphere drag our velocity down until we're fully captured. And the verdict is tragedy. Oh, tragedy. Yep, so we came in too steep. Looks like our science pods exploded first, and our rest of our bits came tumbling after. Okay, so it's a good thing that was all a simulation, so now we can learn from it. Instead of having you watch me repeat that whole procedure, as is often the case in KSP, I'm going to fast forward you through the tweaks to the rocket, where I had battery packs to make sure we have all the charge we need, because really that was the only way in which our rocket was lacking. And then I want to highlight another epiphany that I had, and this is all about establishing our orbit without the aid of those wonderful maneuver nodes. So we know when we reach our takeoff apoapsis, that's when we'll want to burn to raise our periapsis, right? And that the direction of the burn is important, because if everything were super simple, you might think we just burn perfectly horizontal, and that'll do the trick. But in reality, if that's what all that'll actually accomplish is creating an oval on one side of the orbit, and it'll be super awkward. So for our orbit, basically what we're doing is we're aiming to throw ourselves at Kerbin and miss continuously for a long time. I mean, that's what an orbit is. And there's actually a shorthand trick to doing that without the aid of maneuver nodes. So to create a circle, we want to fix our apoapsis as best we can, and that can be our anchor. So by eyeballing our apoapsis, we only have to know which direction to tweak our trajectory to slow the change in that apoapsis value to keep it as close to no change as possible. So basically, if your apo is increasing before you reach it, you need to nose down. And if your apo is climbing after you pass it, then you need to nose up, and vice versa in both situations. So here you can see my adjustments doing just that to get a nice tidy circle. And now we'll repeat our intercept course, nailing it, of course, because we're awesome at rockets in space. And though this time we actually hit it so exactly that we're going to crash into the moon. So we'll correct that with a little anti-radial burn. We'll collect all of our science, exit the moon's influence, and this time we'll go to the safer return route because we have plenty of electrical charge. So we'll bring our periapsis down to 70 kilometers, and then we'll burn retrograde at that periapsis to get a nice low orbit before we deorbit to re-enter. And we'll even remember to collect science to complete our contract. Only, spoiler alert, we'll fail because if you notice we're actually collecting science at 69,000 some odd meters, and it's supposed to be from space, which has to be above 70 kilometers. So, go us. Haha. We will expertly re-enter, even taking the time to do so on the sunny side of Kerbin for optimal visibility, and we won't burn up on re-entry, despite it getting pretty hot for a while. And here we are, drifting pristinely down over the mountains of Kerbin, happily returning home, until... Fortunately, on this trip, I thought ahead and I grabbed the data out of our science modules before we came back to Kerbin, so we didn't lose any of that sweet, sweet science, even as our equipment blew up, because we rolled down a hill. Oh yes, can't make this stuff up. So in the final tally, we got a nice big pile of science to spend in the next episode. We recovered very little of our rocket, but Valentina got another good helping of XP, and our program got a big bump in reputation. So thanks for watching. Like it if you like it, share it with your friends, and if you want to be updated when more comes out, just hit the subscribe button.